Hello everybody, I hope you can hear me. This is our second webinar of today in this academic English series, so welcome everybody. Today's webinar will be academic English tests. What are the challenges in testing language proficiency and academic skills of high-level B2 plus learners? This is presented jointly by Sarah Unsworth and Sian Morgan. I'm Simon Wright from Cambridge University Press, and I'll be moderating today's session along with my colleagues Eve Lloyd and Sarah Stokes. And as I said, this is a series of this webinar is part of a series of academic webinars, and tomorrow is the last day, so there's 2 more sessions tomorrow, and you can still sign up for those by visiting cambridge.org/academic-english, where you'll see a box advertising the conference and then a link in there to register. During the webinar today, you'll be able to hear our speakers and to see the slides, but you won't be able to see them themselves. There's no webcam. And you won't need a microphone. And if you want to ask any questions, please enter them in the chat box, which you'll be able to see on the right-hand side of the screen. A recording of today's webinar, we're going to put all the recordings on the conference registration page, and you'll see a Register Now button, and that will hopefully be replaced in about a week's time with a Watch Again, so you can listen to the webinars again. You'll be able to download a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, and there will be a link which will appear on your screen towards the end of the webinar. So just a little bit of background to the presenters today. Sarah Unsworth is Assessment Group Manager at Cambridge Assessment English, where she has many years' experience developing and producing English tests, including tests of academic English. Sian Morgan works in the Research and Thought Leadership Group at Cambridge Assessment English, working on IELTS, teaching qualifications, research communications and thought leadership projects. Her interests include performance assessment, learning-oriented assessment and teacher assessment literacy. She has taught EAP in Italy, the US and in the UK, and has an MA in Applied Linguistics from Columbia University in New York. So over to you, Sarah and Sian.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon, and a very warm welcome to everybody who's joined us. As Simon said, Sian and I are going to consider in our session the challenges in testing language proficiency and academic skills of high level, so of B2 plus learners. And we're going to be looking at how academic literacy and language proficiency overlap and how they diverge. So first of all, a quick outline of our session. We're going to look today at 2 models of general language proficiency, and we will then go on to look at some definitions of academic literacy, and then move on to look at overlap and divergence between 1 and 2. And finally, we're going to look at the implications of this for testing. So we're going to talk about 2 constructs that are widely used in pedagogic contexts. General language proficiency. This is a construct which focuses on speakers of other languages, and academic literacy, which is conceptualized as a set of skills that are needed for university study, needed for successful university study. And academic literacy is something which, in fact, many first language speakers struggle to develop. So we're going to look this morning at the ways in which they're similar and the ways in which they differ. And in particular, we'll be examining how they intersect in ways that haven't been necessarily examined very closely previously. So general language proficiency is typically modelled on one of 2 distinct but related approaches: the cognitive processing model and the functional model. And I'd like to talk first about the cognitive processing model. This is a model which treats language use as a sequence of hierarchical but interacting processes in which the activation of each higher level of processing requires the activation of all lower levels, interacting therefore in highly complex ways. And these models exist for reading, for writing, for listening and for speaking, But we'd like to focus particularly today on reading, which is of course very relevant in the academic context. So here we can see the cognitive processing model of reading that was developed by Khalifa and Weir back in 2009. We start off with input decoding. This is about recognizing words. We then go on to lexical search, which is about identifying vocabulary, and then syntactic parsing, which is about reading sentences and understanding larger chunks of grammar. So I think, as we'll all recognize, these are very much things which our lower learner levels, lower level learners need to do, and which they need to build upon. And then moving on from this, you've got the higher level processes, which include meaning construction, which is understanding meaning at sentence and paragraph level. And then at the next level, we have discourse construction, which is understanding the meaning of a whole text. And the final stage of processing, which you can see here, only takes place when the reader is combining meaning from multiple sources to create a unified intertextual representation. And this is, of course, much more complex than working with a single text. For example, the coherence and cohesion which would exist within one text will not exist across texts, or there may be conflicting and contradictory information which are contained in the texts. So I think we can see here that this intertextual representation is cognitively complex, and it's particularly relevant to academic learners since, of course, it's a typical demand of students in higher education who, when they're working on assignments of critical thinking, which involve drawing from multiple sources, will need to be able to access and draw on a wide range of resources. And as the reader, as you progress through these different levels within the model, through these different stages within the model, then the processing becomes automatic. So as a reader, you don't require attention or to pay attention to the earlier stages of the model, because this becomes kind of automatic for you. For these learners, we really need to be targeting the higher level processes, and as I just mentioned, intertextual representation is very important in a higher education context. And I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Sian to talk about the second model.
Hi everybody. The cognitive model that we've just looked at with Sarah focuses on latent activity, but a functional model, such as the CEFR, focuses on what language learners can do with a language. And from this, we can infer or understand what underlying cognitive processing has taken place. Now, the mapping from cognitive processing is not always clean. So for assessment purposes, functional models don't have the same predictive power as cognitive models. But importantly, they are very intuitive and practical, as they can be used to describe expected behaviours of language users in real-world context. The CEFR is probably the best known and most widely used functional model. So here on the screen, we have the overall reading descriptors, and each of them shows for reading, and each of them shows the task types, the text types, and the context of use that language users are able to handle at each level. But let's focus on two levels in particular. If we look at the screen, you can see the descriptors for A2, which is a basic level, and C2, proficiency level, for overall reading comprehension. And you can see in bold there in red the key distinctions between the types of text that learners can handle at both these levels in terms of text length, complexity, and their nature, whether they are abstract or concrete. And all of these three dimensions are known to increase the cognitive load when learners are processing a text. And at this point, it might be interesting here to reflect whether all L1 speakers could handle the demands of these C2 descriptors. In other words, can all L1 speakers deal with abstract and structurally complex text, or is this a skill more typically used among people who have experienced further or higher education? So if we look at the focus of the CEFR at higher levels, we can see that it's strongly based on the type of language associated with academic and professional contexts. And this has been called autonomous language by Kay, 1977. In other words, it's the language used by speech communities which collectively own a large body of knowledge, greater than that which any individual can possibly know. And because in these communities, knowledge cannot always be assumed, the relationships and contingent information in a text need to be very explicitly signalled. And of course, this results in longer, more complex texts with more meta-discourse, subordination and nominalization, and much more difficult to read and decode. And perhaps this divide is the reason that many L1 speakers of a language may actually struggle with a C2 level text, as they may not be experienced in the specific education-related uses of language. On the other hand, a non-native learner who has studied in their own country and passed a C2 test may actually struggle with other advanced types of interpersonal language, the kind used in social contexts to build rapport and to make jokes, for example.
Okay, so now we're going to turn to how the concept of academic literacy is used to describe language skills in higher education contexts. Universities in the UK and in the US describe academic literacy as a set of study skills that support successful study at undergraduate level and beyond. However, as we all know, there's a lot of variation in how academic literacy is conceptualised and described. It has been presented as a prerequisite for starting university study, but others consider it as something primarily developed in early undergraduate study. Back in 1986, David Bartholomew pointed out that the language demands of university study can be different to those in other contexts. I think few of us would dispute Bartholomew's conceptualisation of academic language as something that has to be learnt. One key distinction between academic literacy and general language proficiency is that assessments of general language proficiency often have the first language or the native speaker as the implicit model of performance, whereas assessment literacy considers the first language speaker as a starting point for development. And the idea of a first language or a native speaker has been discussed extensively in language assessment, but this has not been necessary when considering academic literacy, because when it comes to academic language, then none of us are actually first language or native speakers. Being a first language speaker is not enough. The subject knowledge and argumentation also come into this as well. So I'd like to consider how the concept of academic literacy is used to describe language skills in higher education contexts. And if we look here at these three examples, they are quotations that people have given from different academic institutions of what academic literacy means to them. And as we can see, there's no universal agreement here, but understandings of academic literacy can actually be placed onto a continuum. So at one end, we have the skills-based approaches, which conceptualize academic literacy as a set of skills with reading, writing, listening, speaking, critical thinking, and also use of technology as well. And then at the other end is the academic literacies approach, which emphasizes more the kind of social, the sort of social and contextual factors that are related to writing. And in assessments and in EAP courses, especially foundation courses prior to starting a course of I think we tend to focus on the more generic skills-based approach because it applies across discipline. Whereas at the other end of the continuum, then the professional knowledge and skills are more discipline-specific, but of course these skills do also have a language proficiency dimension. So as you can see from these quotations, we've got the skills-based approach at one end of the continuum, and then we've got an approach, as we can see from the quotation from Oxford Brookes, that is more compatible with the academic literacies model. Interestingly, these examples targeted at different stages, I think, show how academic language can actually be conceptualized as changing through progressive levels of study. So students need for support in general language proficiency and in academic literacy. And I think also the appropriate balance between these two will change as they progress through their university life. So the academic literacies approach is the dominant approach to higher education writing instruction in the UK. And this emphasises, as I mentioned, social and contextual factors usually related to writing, and challenges the idea of literacy as a set of generic and transferable cognitive skills. However, the academic literacies model is suitable for informing assessment practices because it is critical in emphasis and it is strongly anti-normative. And the rejection of normative academic writing makes it difficult to apply to assessment because there is no normative standard to aim for. So for this reason, I think that assessments and EAP classrooms, for obvious reasons, often focus on academic literacy as a set of skills. But at the same time, I think we need to acknowledge the limitations of this approach and not to express a preference for the skills-based model of academic literacy in all contexts. The best approach to adopt will depend on where the student is in terms of their progression through their study life and on their individual general language proficiency and academic learning needs.
Okay, and obviously there is a degree of overlap between the two models of academic literacy and general language proficiency, and I think there are a couple of key questions to think about regarding where exactly the two models overlap and diverge. First of all, perhaps we need to think to what extent is a certain language of level of language proficiency necessary to be able to acquire academic literacy. So if we look at material and activities typically encountered during university study, we can see that lectures tend to include low-frequency words on specialist topics, and academic articles discuss abstract and theoretical concepts. So both of these features mean that a certain level of language proficiency is needed for listening and reading study material. For productive language skills, undergraduates are expected to use specialist vocabulary and also submit written assignments. So this requires structuring of information and integration of sources, as well as information management generally. And group discussions in seminars also require students to speak and interact about quite complex topics in a sophisticated way. So this notion that a threshold of language proficiency is necessary for university study is also reflected in the fact that admissions criteria for international students who want to study through the medium of English are often specified at a certain language level. So, to what extent then is a certain level of language proficiency a prerequisite, and what kind of level is needed? So, how much do we need for different types of study? For example, what CEFR proficiency levels will allow students to work with academic texts? B1, B2, C1? We assume that a student with C2 language proficiency will pick up academic literacy more quickly and effectively than someone at B2. But how much quicker? And can someone at B1 work effectively with academic texts at all? Then we have disciplinary differences. Do humanities courses require higher starting levels than scientific subjects? These are all questions which could be informed and supported by empirical studies. For example, a systematic evaluation of the CEFR can-do statements by discipline experts and study skills tutors might shed some light on this. It might also be worth comparing the development of native speakers and non-native speakers at a range of GLP levels in an academic context. So we would argue that a high level of language proficiency is intrinsically academic. If we look at the CEFR can-do statements describing C1 and C2, we can see that the conceptualizations of GLP at higher levels do indeed have an academic component built into them. For example, I'm just reading these out to you. The C2 descriptors for overall reading comprehension refer to the handling of abstract, structurally complex language, long complex texts, appreciating subtle distinctions of style and implicit and as well as explicit meaning, whereas the C1, C2 descriptors for reading for information and argument are even more explicit, can understand in detail a wide range of lengthy, complex texts likely to be encountered in social, professional or academic life, identified in finer points of detail, including attitudes and implied as well as stated opinions. So what tasks can we use to assess higher level language proficiency? And if we look at this example of a Cambridge C1 Advanced Reading Comprehension, you can see that this tests intrinsically academic skills. Here, the test taker has to read extracts from articles written by academics and then compare the views that these authors express on various topics. So this is a kind of reading skill used in university study contexts to establish scholarly arguments made in a range of subjects, and it elicits higher order reading skills. And here, on the next slide, we have a C2 writing task, which reflects the CEFR overall descriptors for writing at that level. And again, I'll read these out to you. Can produce clear, smoothly flowing, complex reports, articles or essays, which present a case or give a critical appreciation of proposals or literary works. So here we see rhetorical skills are important at this level. They also, another descriptor is, can provide an appropriate and effective logical structure to find significant points. So this is a GLP model, but again, we might ask ourselves whether a native speaker or first language speaker without academic experience could actually complete this task. And now let's go on and look at some tasks, sample tasks from an academic setting. These tasks that you see on the screen are all from a first-year psychology course on personality and individual differences. The first two are from the coursework component of the course, and the last one is an exam question. There are a couple of questions to consider here. How many reading sources would we expect the student to have engaged with in order to answer these questions? And can you demonstrate academic literacy on these tasks without specialised knowledge? How long do you think a typical response for the task would be in terms of word count? All of these questions demonstrate that academic literacy in a university setting, in order to be accomplished in this, you need discipline-specific knowledge, and it would be difficult to attempt these questions without that.
Okay, so moving on to our final part of our presentation, which is the implications for testing. Investigating the relationship between academic literacy and general language proficiency may also help develop language tests that are more sensitive to the needs of university study. In 2016, Murray and Nalea highlighted that some students face language problems at university despite meeting general language proficiency entry criteria. They advocated assuming that all students, including those with English as a first language, need to develop familiarity with academic language. Demonstrating that first language English speakers need support to develop academic literacy would empirically contribute to the arguments for these interventions. Assessments designed specifically for evaluating assessment literacy could be administered to first language English speakers to support these kind of approaches. Many approaches to developing students' academic writing draw on an academic literacies model, which rejects the skills-focused approaches. However, conceptualizing some aspects of academic literacy as skills, because assessment tools can then standardize feedback for very specific areas, more generic areas, so that teachers and instructors can devote time to commenting on more nuanced and subject-specific aspects. And this approach recognises that some aspects of academic literacy are unsuitable for assessment as a set of generic skills. So, can language testers avoid conflating the concepts of EAP and general language proficiency? Can you assess C2 without including academic literacy? Well, I think probably not. I think there is clearly overlap between academic literacy and the top level of general language proficiency. What we should be doing is reviewing high-level language tests in order to identify the academic literacy components. It's clear that there is both overlap and divergence between the two concepts, and this is an observation which must have implications for language testers. I think the task for us is to identify those similarities and differences in detail, determine the consequences, and then to use this information in order to guide both test and academic course design. And we've got some references here from some of the studies that we've referred to during the presentation.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks to both Sarah and Sian for that webinar.
Questions.
If you do have any questions you'd like to put to them, please add them into the chat box now. We have one already, and I shall read this out. It's from Monica. A question with regards to the models and where they overlap. This is the graph that shows the academic literacy, which falls somewhere between B2, C1, C2 level, and UK universities accept candidates at IELTS 5.5 for foundation courses. So the question is, how can we develop academic literacy at the lower levels?
Okay, well, I think it's important. This is Sian, by the way. I think if a lot of foundation courses do actually accept lower levels, because the purpose of a foundation course is actually to develop language ability and academic skills. So I don't think that this is a problem, because the academic skills would also be part of the whole point of the foundation course. But I do agree with you that some universities actually ask for quite well, or specify lower levels than perhaps would be ideal, and because of this we need perhaps more assessment literacy on the part of admissions staff, because sometimes they don't know as well as they should what exactly these CEFR levels mean in terms of actual language use. So that is a problem, and at Cambridge we do actually do some sort of sessions with different admissions students from different universities to let them know what a 5.5 on IELTS looks like.
Yeah, and the other thing that I would add to that is that going back to the cognitive model that I showed right at the beginning of the presentation, I think that we need to be thinking with lower level learners who come in and they need to be following an academic course. You know, we need to be thinking about, well, how can we build them up so that they are ready and capable of coping on a university course? And, you know, so I think we need to start with helping them with some of the lower level processes, but obviously we need to be building up and thinking about, well, you know, how can we help them to work through these levels so that they get to a point where they are able to read you know, a lot of different texts and to draw information from, you know, many differing texts. And the other thing I would say is that, you know, although that is a skill that we associate with a higher level of reading, you can also introduce your lower level students to that skill of being able to look at lots of different texts and to put together and summarize from a lot of different texts. And you can get them doing that, for example, even with, you know, reviews of films, or, you know, looking at simple cinema descriptions of a film at cinema, and then deciding, you know, what are the key points and what are the different perspectives that are being brought. So I think that even at lower levels, it's about trying to help people with the kind of skills that they're going to need in an academic environment. And we can do that also using lower level language as well.
Yes, I just wanted to say, again, with lower levels, one of the problems is that perhaps the students don't actually realise where the next stage of their learning is. So one way that you could help them move forward is by, if you can obtain these, find, for example, with writing or speaking, showing them models of performance slightly above the level they're working at now, so they can notice the gap. And perhaps this could be a class discussion led by the teacher to look at the features of writing or speaking that they're not using yet.
Just another question here that's come in. It's from Peng. It says, some students asked about academic vocabulary when they're writing their essays. Is there any material about academic vocabulary or any other suggestions that you might have?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of course books, including Unlock, the Unlock series, and also including some of the additional supplementary material that goes along with Empower, that can help a lot with developing academic vocabulary. Obviously, this is in quite a generic way because we can't know every single discipline and therefore know the exact discipline specific vocabulary that's going to be required. But again, I think we can really help students taking a skills-based approach to understand, you know, what are the skills.
Lovely, thank you very much for that. Go on, fine.
Academic vocabulary that is generic and that would be helpful. I just wanted to add as well one more book called Academic Vocabulary in Use that Sian has been
excellent.
Me about.
Thank you for those tips there. I think that's all we have time for today's webinars. Thank you again. Thanks very much to Sarah and Sian, and thanks everybody for joining us. We're really happy to have everybody here from a number of different countries. You will see on the screen now there's a download link to a certificate of attendance for today's webinar. Please click on that and download it. If you do have issues, we will be emailing this out to everybody, because when you register we will have your email addresses, so we'll email that out to everybody. And a few people have asked in the chat box, how do we watch this session again, or how can we watch other sessions again? Well, what we're going to do is, on the registration page where you registered on the website, there was a register now button, and we're going to replace that with a watch again button for each webinar. It won't be immediately after the session, it will probably be in about a week's time, so if you could just bear with us on that, and if you can just log in anytime you want to the registration page again. We'll leave that up, and then you'll be able to watch the sessions, or sorry, listen to the sessions again that way. So thanks again to our presenters for today, and we have 2 final webinars tomorrow. So please log on to the website and register for those, and the address that you need is cambridge.org/academic-English. So thanks again everybody, and we shall hopefully hear from you soon. Bye bye.